He was born gasping for breath and spent his life charging into the wind. Theodore Roosevelt was not just a president. He was a storm, a cowboy, a soldier, a writer, a hunter, a father. He shaped the 20th century with fists clenched and eyes wide open. This is not just the story of power. It's the story of fight, of grief, of a man who refused to be ordinary, even when the world tried to break him. If you love history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1: The Boy Who Couldn't Breathe. He came into the world in 1858 in the heart of New York City with lungs too weak to cry. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was small, sickly. Asthma strangled his sleep. His breath wheezed like a broken windpipe. At night, his parents would rush him to open windows, desperate for air. But what he lacked in strength, he made up for in will. His father, Theodore Sr., was a towering, warm-hearted man, and he refused to let his son surrender to frailty. "You have the mind, but not the body," he told young Theodore. "Without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should." And so, the boy began to fight back. He took up boxing, hiking, climbing. Every cough, every wheeze, he met them with clenched teeth and bloody knuckles. He built his body with brute force and discipline. He refused to be defined by what he couldn't do. But it wasn't just muscles that grew. Theodore became obsessed with nature. He studied birds, bugs, bones. He wrote his own natural history books before he was 10. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a watcher, a learner, a young man electrified by the world around him. As the Civil War raged, his family stood divided. His mother, a Southern belle from Georgia. His father, a Northern Unionist who refused to fight, not out of fear, but because he couldn't abandon his family. This tension, duty versus love, justice versus loyalty, would echo through Roosevelt's life. He entered Harvard still struggling to breathe, still clinging to ambition like a lifeline. He read voraciously. He talked too fast. He boxed between classes and studied until candlelight gave out. People saw him as odd, too energetic, too earnest. But those were the very traits that would make him unforgettable. And then at 25, with a young wife and a new baby, tragedy struck. On the same day, his wife and his mother died. Same house, same night, just hours apart. In his diary, he wrote one sentence, one line in black ink. "The light has gone out of my life." And then, he vanished. Next, we ride west, where a broken man seeks rebirth in the wild heart of America. Chapter 2: The Badlands Reborn. He went where the wind had teeth, where winter killed men without remorse, and silence stretched across the plains like a dare. Theodore Roosevelt, scholar, aristocrat, widower, rode into the Badlands of Dakota Territory looking for something he couldn't name. He bought land, raised cattle, and buried himself in the work of survival. Here there was no pity, no politics, just sky, sweat, and the bite of prairie frost. The men who met him, rough cowboys, hardened ranchers, thought him a joke at first. With his pince-nez glasses, manic speech, and Harvard polish, he looked like he didn't belong. But he stayed. He rode in storms. He tracked outlaws. He shot his own meat. He earned scars and respect. One night, when thieves stole his boat, he chased them down the Little Missouri River for days, rifle on his lap, justice in his veins. When he caught them, he stood guard for 40 hours without sleep, then marched them across frozen plains to deliver them to the sheriff. No one laughed after that. And slowly, the wilderness began to mend him. The land, brutal and bare, gave him something gentler men could not: Purpose. Challenge. The proof that he could be reborn. In the silence of the Badlands, he stopped mourning. He started becoming. He wrote by firelight. He hunted elk and read Homer. He studied wolves, watched sunsets, buried cattle, and measured himself against the unforgiving world. This was not a retreat. It was an anvil. And by the time he returned to New York, he was steel. But the East had changed too. Corruption gripped the city. Political machines ruled the people. And Roosevelt, forged in grief and grit, was ready to fight back. Next, we return to New York, where the cowboy turns crusader, and the name Teddy begins to echo through the halls of power. Chapter 3, The Rough Rider of New York. He returned to New York like a thunderclap, not as the broken widower who had fled, but as a man reborn in dust and fire. Theodore Roosevelt now moved with purpose, sharp, loud, undeniable. He ran for public office with fists swinging and speeches blazing. Corruption, laziness, privilege, he attacked them all with equal fury. As a member of the New York State Assembly, he was relentless. He slammed his hand on desks. He called out powerful men by name. He was young, unafraid, and unstoppable. But politics is not a straight road, and Roosevelt had enemies. They mocked him as too wild, too self-righteous, too loud, and when he tried to climb higher, they blocked him. So he adapted. He took a job on the U.S. Civil Service Commission, a post no one cared about. And he made it matter. He exposed fraud, fired the incompetent, protected the honest. Then he became New York City's police commissioner and turned the force upside down. He walked the midnight streets himself, checking if officers were at their posts. He shut down brothels and gambling dens. He faced death threats and laughed. But it was not just about order. It was about justice. He believed government could work, not for the rich, but for everyone. And the public began to notice. The cowboy reformer, the principled brawler, the man who didn't just talk about change, but forced it through locked doors. Then war came. Cuba, 1898. Spain was holding the island in a chokehold, and America prepared to intervene. Roosevelt, now Assistant Secretary of the Navy, saw his moment. He resigned, not to lead from behind, but to fight. He gathered a ragtag regiment of cowboys, Ivy Leaguers, Native Scouts, and adventurers. They called themselves the Rough Riders. Next, we land on the sands of Cuba, where Roosevelt charges through bullets and blood into legend. Chapter 4, Charge Up San Juan Hill. It was hell in khaki, jungle heat, mud thick as cement, mosquitoes like knives, and bullets, always bullets. Cuba, 1898. The Spanish-American War had begun, and Roosevelt had thrown himself into its fire. As Lieutenant Colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders, he led a band of misfits and legends. They trained fast, ate worse, slept on the ground, and when the order came, they landed in Cuba like thunder. Roosevelt was not content to lead from the rear. He rode at the front, glasses on, pistol raised, teeth clenched. In the chaos of battle, his horse became stuck in the barbed underbrush. He dismounted and charged on foot. The target, Kettle Hill, part of the larger San Juan Heights. Under a sky streaked with smoke and shouts, Roosevelt led the charge. Bullets snapped past his ears. Men fell beside him. But he climbed. He later wrote, "It was the greatest day of my life," and it was. Because that day, he didn't just fight. He proved to himself, to his men, to the world, that courage was not something you claimed. It was something you lived. The image of Roosevelt, dusty, fearless, commanding from horseback, would become legend. And when the battle was over and the Rough Riders returned home, the newspapers had their hero. He had stared down death and grinned. He had fought with valor, not for conquest, but for meaning. And the American people took notice. He was no longer just a reformer. He was a warrior. They begged him to run for governor of New York. And he did. He won. And just like the Badlands, just like the battlefields of Cuba, he brought fire into every room he entered. But powerful men were nervous. He couldn't be controlled. And so, they hatched a plan. They would bury him in the vice presidency, a powerless role, a quiet exile. They didn't understand one thing. You don't sideline a storm. Next, we enter the White House, not through ambition, but through tragedy, and witness how Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history. Chapter 5: The Accidental Presidents. September 6, 1901. Buffalo, New York. A man pulls a pistol, fires twice. President William McKinley falls. 8 days later, he is dead. And Theodore Roosevelt is President of the United States. At just 42 years old, he becomes the youngest person ever to hold the office. He hadn't chased it. The job had found him, through violence, through accident, through fate. When word reached him, he was hiking in the Adirondacks. He rushed to Buffalo, hand on his chest, eyes clouded. "I'll do the best I can," he whispered. But he didn't just do well. He transformed the office. From the moment he stepped into the Oval Office, Roosevelt brought movement. He refused to sit still. He broke tradition. He wielded the presidency like a saber. He invited black leaders to the White House, enraging the South. He took on powerful business trusts, enraging Wall Street. He sided with striking coal miners, enraging industrialists. To Roosevelt, government was not meant to watch. It was meant to act. He called it the bully pulpit, a platform not just for policy, but for moral leadership. He spoke directly to the people, with passion, with clarity, with fire, and they listened. He pushed through the Pure Food and Drug Act after reading The Jungle. He created the Department of Commerce and Labor and forced transparency from monopolies. He wasn't against wealth. He was against abuse. And behind it all, the cowboy still rode. He boxed in the White House, read a book a day, played with his 6 wild children, letting goats and ponies roam the lawns. He was not a normal president. He was something else, something electric. And when it came time to run for his own term, he crushed the vote. A landslide. But power was never enough for Roosevelt. He wanted justice, fairness, a square deal, not just for the rich, but for the American people. Next, we ride into his second term, where ideals clash with reality, and the weight of the world begins to press down on even the strongest shoulders. Chapter 6: The Square Deal par Deal Tiki. He called it fairness, honest work, honest reward. A square deal for the miner, the banker, the farmer, the immigrant. In his second term, Roosevelt turned idealism into policy. He went after the trusts, those bloated monopolies that squeezed workers and crushed competition. He broke up the Northern Securities Company, the railroads, the meat packers. Wall Street trembled, but Roosevelt stood firm. He wasn't anti-business. He was anti-corruption. Men with the muckrake, he called them, digging through filth to find truth. And he welcomed them. He strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission. He regulated railroads. He expanded antitrust enforcement. And behind every policy was a core belief: that democracy would rot if left in the hands of the greedy. But TR wasn't just focused on industry. He turned to the land. He saw the American wilderness not as a resource to be stripped, but as a legacy to protect. He preserved over 230 million acres of forests, parks, and wildlife refuges. He created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests. Standing in the Grand Canyon, he said, "Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it." He invited writers, scientists, and conservationists to help shape policy. The land was sacred, not for profit, but for posterity. But not all was noble. He expanded the Navy, flexed American power abroad. He orchestrated the Panama Canal, a triumph of engineering, but a storm of politics. He once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And he did. He mediated peace between Japan and Russia, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But he also sent the Great White Fleet around the world, a floating declaration of American might. And through it all, he never stopped moving. He wrote books, met ambassadors, taught his children to box, invited prize-fighters to spar. But time was catching up. His health faltered, his energy burned fast, and when the term ended, he did something few expected. He stepped down. "I will not run again," he declared, and with that, he walked away from the most powerful seat on earth. But peace never lasted long for Roosevelt. Next, we follow him into the wild once more, this time through the heart of Africa and into the shadows of legacy. Chapter 7, Into the Heart of Africa. He left the White House and went deeper into the wilderness than ever before. No speeches, no headlines, just jungle, sweat, and the rhythm of a continent unknown to him. In 1909, Theodore Roosevelt set out on a grand expedition to East Africa, accompanied by scientists from the Smithsonian, his son Kermit, and an army of guides, porters, and hunters. It was not a vacation. It was a mission. To collect specimens, to study ecosystems, to feel small again in the face of nature's raw power. They trekked through thorns and dust, camped under starlight, faced stampedes, fevers, and heat that crushed bones. Roosevelt hunted, yes, but also documented. Over 11,000 animals were recorded, many sent to American museums. By today's standards, it's controversial. But in his time, it was science, preservation, understanding. And for Roosevelt, it was life renewed. He journaled every day, shot expertly, watched sunsets in silence, talked with tribes, trained his son in grit and patience. But even the wilderness could not keep him from the pull of politics. Back in America, the country was shifting. His chosen successor, William Howard Taft, was failing him. Taft rolled back reforms, coddled big business, moved slowly, carefully. To Roosevelt, it was betrayal. He returned to the States furious, not just at Taft, but at himself. He had stepped away too soon. The work wasn't done. The people, he believed, needed him. And so, in 1912, he did the unthinkable. He ran again, but not as a Republican. They had rejected him. So he formed a new party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, because when asked if he was fit to run, he roared, "I'm as strong as a bull moose." The campaign was a whirlwind. He traveled by train, gave hundreds of speeches, shaking the system to its core. But it would come at a price. Next, we enter the most dramatic election in U.S. history, and the moment when a bullet could not stop him. But politics nearly did. Chapter 8, The Bullet and the Bull Moose. Milwaukee, October 14th, 1912. Roosevelt steps out of his hotel, tips his hat, waves to the crowd. A man approaches, raises a revolver, fires. The bullet strikes his chest. Blood. Gasps. Panic. But Roosevelt doesn't fall. He touches the wound, feels for blood, finds none in his mouth. The lung isn't hit. He turns to the crowd and says, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And then, bleeding, breath labored, he delivers a 90-minute speech. His manuscript, folded in his breast pocket, helped slow the bullet. But it was his will that carried him through. Doctors begged him to rest. He refused. This was no ordinary campaign. This was a war for the soul of the country. The 1912 election was three-way chaos. Taft, the Republican. Wilson, the Democrat. Roosevelt, the progressive renegade. Roosevelt won more votes than Taft, but the split handed victory to Woodrow Wilson. He had lost, but not quietly. He went back to writing, to ranching, to speaking truth, even without power. But his body was failing. That bullet would stay inside him forever. In 1913, he embarked on one final mad adventure, the exploration of an uncharted river in the Brazilian Amazon. It would nearly kill him. He suffered from malaria, infections, a leg wound that refused to heal. He dropped 50 pounds, prepared to die in the jungle. But Kermit, his loyal son, refused to let him go. They emerged, skeletal and broken, but alive. And with them, maps of a river no outsider had ever seen. The River of Doubt. Back home, Roosevelt was a shadow of the man he'd been. Older, slower, but still watching, still writing, still roaring, in bursts. He criticized Wilson's handling of World War I, begged to lead troops again. He was denied. But 5 of his sons went to war. 1 would not return. Next, we witness the twilight of a lion, and the quiet moment when even the fiercest heart must rest. Chapter 9, The Lion's Last Roar. The war changed him. Not the kind fought with rifles, but the one fought inside a father's heart. His youngest son, Quentin, had joined the air service in World War I. Bright, brave, a pilot, like the heroes in adventure novels Roosevelt himself had once written. In July 1918, Quentin's plane was shot down over France. He was just 20. When Roosevelt heard the news, he didn't weep. He sat still, silent. But something in him dimmed. Friends said he never truly smiled again. The years had taken their toll. The malaria, the bullet, the miles, the rage, the sheer speed of his living. His body began to betray him. He walked with a cane. His lungs labored. Still, he wrote thousands of letters, essays, and books. He called for American preparedness. He warned of complacency. He urged young men to serve, to be strong, not just in muscle, but in character. In public, he was still the bull moose. In private, he faded quietly. On January 6, 1919, he went to bed with a book under his arm. He spoke with his daughter, kissed his wife, and closed his eyes. He died in his sleep. No drama, no headline, just silence. His son Archie sent a telegram. "The old lion is dead." He was 60 years old, but in that short time, he had lived more than most men could in 3 lifetimes. He had been a sickly child, a grieving husband, a cowboy, a soldier, a president, an explorer, a reformer, a writer, a father, a force of nature. Next, we close this story with a look not just at what Roosevelt did, but what he meant. Chapter 10, The Man in the Arena. He once said, "It is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." Dusty, bloody, daring greatly. That was Theodore Roosevelt. Not perfect, not polished, but present in every moment, every fight, every breath. He redefined the presidency, not as a distant seat of power, but as a pulpit, a forge, a battlefield. He expanded the national parks. He tamed monopolies. He built canals, made peace, and still found time to read a book before breakfast. But beyond the policies, beyond the speeches, he gave something else. Permission. Permission to be bold, to challenge the powerful, to fight for fairness, to live fully, even when breath is short, grief is deep, or failure is near. He showed what it meant to be alive. To push, to break, to rise again, to charge into life with your teeth bared and your heart on fire. He was not made for silence, and he never accepted stillness. Even now, more than a century later, his words echo. His face carved into granite, his legacy written in forests, factories, and freedoms. He remains the man in the arena. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Theodore Roosevelt, a man who refused to break and dared to live out loud. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More powerful voices from history await. Until next time, stay bold, stay curious, and keep stepping into the arena.